We're all here today to hear one man speak, and he certainly needs no introduction. But this does give us an opportunity to celebrate some of his accomplishments. William Dalrymple is one of Britain's great historians and the best-selling author of the Wolfsman prize-winning White Mughals, The Last Mughal, which won the Duff Cooper Prize, and the Hemingway and Kapuscinski prize-winning Return of a King. A frequent broadcaster, he has written and presented 3 television series, one of which won the Grierson Award for the Best Documentary Series at BAFTA. He has also won the Thomas Cook Travel Book Award, the Sunday Times Young British Writer of the Year Award, at the Foreign Correspondent of the Year, at the FPA Media Awards. He has been awarded 5 honorary doctorates. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the Royal Asiatic Society, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and has held visiting fellowships at Princeton, Brown, and All Souls University of Oxford. He writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and the Guardian. In 2018, he was presented with the prestigious President's Medal by the British Academy for his outstanding literary achievement and for co-founding the Jaipur Literature Festival. He is the co-host of the chart-topping podcast Empire with Anita Anand. He lives with his wife and 3 children on a farm outside Delhi.
Well, how lovely to be back in my favorite Indian museum. The Buddha was enlightened under a peepal tree, but I don't think I've ever given a talk under a mango tree before. Luckily, it's not in season, so we're not going to have plumps around us as delicious mango falls on our heads. India was one of those places like ancient Greece and ancient China, where the great big questions facing humanity were first answered. What are we doing here? Why are we here? How do we live moral lives? What is the world around us? How should we measure the world around us? How do we measure time and space? How do we estimate our relationship with the heavens? Those of us brought up in the West are very familiar with the answers which the ancient Greeks gave to those questions. Anyone in Europe or America by the age of 5 or 6 will know exactly what Archimedes got up to in his bath, or how Pythagoras discovered pi. China also has been very good at telling its story. Today in London, there are not 1 but 2 exhibitions celebrating the Silk Road. Magnificent shows, both of them, but ones which completely exclude the centrality of ancient India at the center of global trade networks, and where, astonishingly, in the British Library exhibition, India is plunged into quite literal darkness on the map of the exhibition, although Dunhuang, the place being celebrated in the exhibition, received its Buddhism and many of the texts which are in the exhibition from India. I first realized quite the, I'm not sure the clicker is working, or is it on? Here we go. I first realized, and the journey that led to this book began when I received this picture on my phone 5 years ago, freshly, soon after it had been dug up by archaeologists. It's an extraordinary image in all sorts of ways. Firstly, you'll notice that although it's the head of the Buddha, very obviously, it's in marble, not just any marble, but Proconnessian marble, the smartest imperial marble from the mines and the Marmara Sea, now in Turkey. But the archaeologists working on it after its excavation soon realized that the exact bore of the drill used in what they nicely called the tortellini curls of the Buddha's head indicated it came from a workshop in Alexandria in Egypt, which also adds to the strangeness of, the strangeness of these sunbeams splaying out from behind the Buddha's head. Is this some reference to Sol Invictus or Surya or Mithras? But the most extraordinary thing about this was where it was found, in a temple to the goddess Isis on the Red Sea coast of Egypt. Not a place that we would normally associate in any way with the Buddha. And it became, at a moment when I happened to be equally far to the east. Egypt must be, 4,000 miles from Kerala, from Muziris. Angkor Wat must be, 5,000 or 6,000 miles to the east. And yet in both places, you're seeing the ripples of Indian influence, whether it is in the head of a Buddha or in the extraordinary friezes in Angkor Wat, which tell on the banks of the Mekong stories first told on the banks of the Yamuna or the Ganga. Stories about the Battle of Lanka and the Ramayana, stories about the Battle of Kurukshetra, stories of Krishna in Vrindavan with the gopis. And receiving this picture of a newly discovered Buddha's head from Egypt while wandering around another area rich in Indian influence made me put two and two together about what is in many ways a sort of blindingly obvious insight, because it's sitting there in plain sight, this extraordinary amplitude of Indian influence around the world. Buddhism, the most obvious Indian and most successful Indian export from ancient India, spread first to Sri Lanka, then Burma, Thailand, Laos, right on through China, Japan and Korea, Mongolia and Siberia. We all know that to this day, Bali is still Hindu. All over Laos and Vietnam, we can see images of the Ramayana, and we know the popularity of the shadow puppetry of the Ramayana in countries ranging from Burma through Java to Cambodia. All this is, in a sense, blindingly obvious, and yet the world has not given India its centrality in the ancient world that it exists. I don't mean this in a tub-thumping, nationalistic, political sense, but just the sheer absence of knowledge outside India about ancient India. For example, the fact that the number systems that we all use every day were first developed in India. In the West, we know about Pythagoras and Archimedes, but we never, ever teach in our schools about Brahmagupta or Aryabhatta, who effectively gave us the number systems, including the symbol for zero, which we use every day. I've just come from a book tour around Britain, and even in Oxford and Cambridge, the only people putting up their hands when I asked who knows about these people were the Desis in the audience. How has it come to that? How is it that only Indians know about their past? And even there is a sort of confusion. The comic Sanjeev Bhaskar's goodness gracious me character, the kind of WhatsApp uncle saying Leonardo da Vinci, Indian, royal family, Indian, Jesus Christ, Indian, reflects a sort of muddle about what India gave to the world. People here know that India was this profound civilization which gave so much, and yet no one outside India knows this or gives it credit for what it is. And why is that? Well, partly it must be admitted straight up that Victorian Indology probably played a major role in this. The ideas of the generation of Macaulay, who could say with a straight face that a single shelf of a good English library was worth more than the entire native literature of India and Arabia. We laugh about that now, but the shadow of those attitudes persist in our education systems. The fact that we're not taught about Indian numbers, that no one knows Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta, comes back to that sort of prejudice. But I think this map has a certain role to play in the ignorance that so much of the world has about ancient India. the map of the Silk Road. In itself, a wonderful idea that breaks nationalistic silos down, this idea of a trade route that connects the Mediterranean with the South China Sea, this elusive line of dots crossing the thin waste of Asia, allegedly following ancient trade routes. And particularly note that in this map taken at random from one of the many 20 or 30 books published every year on the Silk Road, that it is the ancient names. It is Antioch, Palmyra, Petra, implying that this map and this road is something that goes back to distant antiquity. And yet this map is profoundly wrong. In many ways, it is a lie. It does not reflect, in any sense, the true nature of ancient trade in the classical period. You can make a case for it in the 13th century after the Mongols have smashed a hole through the middle of Asia. And at that period, Marco Polo does indeed go from Jerusalem, where he gets oil from the Holy Sepulchre and deposits it 2.5 years later in Xanadu in Mongolia. But before that, there are hostile borders, almost at all periods of history, between Persia and the Roman or Byzantine world. And this in no way reflects any reality of the classical period. Bear in mind this map, memorize it for a second, and compare it to this map produced by the Oxford Archaeology Department this summer. Andrew Wilson, who studies ancient coin distribution, produced this. It shows Roman coin hoards. And this, in a sense, is the reality of the fantasy expressed in the previous map. So where do Roman coins turn up? They turn up in France, of course, in Italy, in Spain. They also turn up along the North African coast, in the Levant, on the coast of Turkey and Greece and the Balkans, falling off to the north as you near Scandinavia and Germany. A little scattering down the Nile, a few in Yemen. Let's get this pointer out. Here we go. Yemen, the Nile, a little scattering in Afghanistan and the banks of the Caspian. But look at this. Look at India. India was, in reality, the principal trading partner of the Roman Empire. We know this. Pliny is so irate about the amount of Roman gold ending up in Indian pockets that he complains that India is the drain of all the precious metals in the world. Strabo, traveling with the new governor of Egypt, goes to the Red Sea port of Myas Hormuz, Mussel Harbor, if you like. And he sees 250 vessels waiting for the right winds to turn to travel to India. This was the kind of trading fleets that were leaving every year in both directions. Yet, in the current British Museum show, there is an exhibition which purports to show the trade routes of the period between 500 and 1000, and India does not appear in this show. Japan appears, China appears, Turkmenistan appears, the entire North African coast appears. India does not have a place stand in the way that all these other places do. It has been removed from a conception of ancient trade which is profoundly not only wrong but specifically Sinocentric. It is no coincidence that it has Chinese sponsors, this map, this show, and a Chinese curator. And it is on the back of this profoundly wrong map that Xi Jinping has built his Belt and Road and the whole superstructure of a modern trading network and loan network that, in reality, has attempted to create the fantasy map that we see in the Silk Road. I feel quite angry about this because it's profoundly, scholarly inaccurate. This is the shape of ancient trade. And India is at the center of it. And if you're talking about Buddhist networks, as the British Library show does, India is even more at the center of things, as Nalanda, Bodh Gaya, Sarnath are the center of the Buddhist world. So to try and sinicize it and actively exclude India, to plunge it quite literally in the maps in these shows into darkness, seems to be a profound scholarly lie, actually. It's not too strong a word. So I'm going to talk now about the three fields that I feel projected India's influence in a very real and tangible way around the world. First of all, talking about Buddhism. Secondly, talking about the whole package of Hindu kingship, Sanskrit literature, that brought Hinduism to Southeast Asia and resulted in the greatest Hindu temple in the world being built not here in India, but in Cambodia, Angkor Wat. Arguably also the capital, don't tell Mr. Modi, of probably the widest ranging Hindu empire in history, which was the Khmer Empire. But we've forgotten this. We've edited our histories out to remove a very profound reality. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about Indian numbers. The Indian numerals, 0, place value, and the whole system of Indian mathematics that altered mathematics around the world, and which slowly move out of India from Pataliputra to Mount Abu to Baghdad, and finally, 600 years after these discoveries are made in India, finally reach Europe in the 12th century, which is where we're going to end up. So, Buddhism, first of all. So the Buddha is a historical character, probably living in the mid-5th century, possibly in the late 4th century BCE. But the early days of Buddhism are shrouded in mystery. There are no inscriptions and precious little archaeological material for the first 150 years, 200 years of Buddhism. The lights only go on with Ashoka in 250 BCE. Suddenly, you get substantial monuments all over India, and where you've had no epigraphy before, suddenly you get waterfalls of words flowing over the rock shelters and down the pillars of Ashoka's amazing pillar sculptures and rock shelter inscriptions. It is Ashoka's conversion that projects Buddhism beyond India in a variety of surprising directions. The inscription at Kandahar specifically says that Ashoka sends Dharma ministers as far as Cyrene, which is modern Libya. It's a long way. He also sends them out into Anatolia, and there are certain Greek inscriptions in Anatolia that seem to echo the wording of Ashoka, but with the Greek word Eusebia substituted for the Sanskrit or Pali Dharma or Dhamma. It is during the reign of Ashoka that we begin to see the rock monasteries of the Deccan hollowed out. Ajanta, Cave 1, much later, but worth always putting up the Bodhisattva Padmapani in his incredible beauty with the wonderful figure that Stella Cramrish memorably described as being caught in a gale of stillness. This figure suspended between worlds, not accepting enlightenment so that he can remain in this world to guide the Buddha's followers. The Buddha has gone. He is a flame extinguished. He cannot answer the faithful's prayers, but the Bodhisattvas are there. You can reach out to them. And again, only an hour and a half, whatever it is, journey from here outside Pune, in Baja, this extraordinary rock face, which preserves the forms of a lost Indian architecture in wood and bamboo. And I particularly like this sort of couple looking out of their apartment window and waving as if from a Bombay balcony, or a Pune balcony. But here in the Great Arch, the stupa and the vihara. But it is to the south in Anuradhapura that Ashoka sends his son Mahinda. And Mahinda preaches outside Anuradhapura, and eventually the king of Anuradhapura converts to Buddhism, encouraging his people to do likewise. And as recently as 2 years ago, the stupa under which Mahinda's ashes were deposited turns up at Rajagala with a Brahmi inscription saying Mahinda on it. And this is a sort of prototype of the stupa. We're all familiar with this sort of perfect bell shape. But this is how it begins, just a pile of stones over a cremation. So that by the death of Ashoka and Mahinda, Sri Lanka itself has become a center of the Buddhist mission. And within a few generations, a miracle takes place. Buddhism spirals out of the Gangetic Plain, where it remained for 200 years, travels up to Gandhara, to Bactria, to Dunhuang. This is the map we should be seeing in the British Museum and the British Library shows. This is a map that has some meaning and which is historically accurate. Over to China, into Korea, Japan, through Burma, Siam, Vietnam, Guangzhou, to the Philippines. Who knew? Extraordinary. And by 100 AD, in the aftermath of the suicide of Antony Cleopatra, remember your literature lessons at school, the asp to Cleopatra's breast, Octavius seizes Egypt and joins it to the Roman Empire, and now India has a border with Rome. It's a border which, thanks to the monsoon winds, takes only 2 months to cross. Once Indians had learned to ride the monsoon winds, you can move from Maziris to Aden to Berenike and Myas Hormuz in as little as 2 months. Down here and up to Berenike and Myas Hormuz. This is where Strabo sees 250 vessels waiting to travel to India. And this is based on the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is the kind of Lonely Planet, or the rough guide for Roman sailors of the 1st century. And so familiar are the Romans that they know every single port, including the ones around where we are now, Kalyan, Sopora. These are all places that the Roman Empire knows well. They know the particular quirks of each port, which one you have to be careful with shoals going into the harbor, which one you need to have some sort of vessel helping you. The weird proclivities of the Raja of Barigaza, who had a particular taste for Roman singing boys, for example. All this sort of gossipy intimacy is there in the Periplus. While China, under the very north, the sea outside it is a land called Theiss. There is an inland city. It is hard to get to. That is as close as the Romans ever get to having any awareness at all about China. No direct, it's hard to get to. It's far away. And the Periplus says the best place to get silk is Barigaza. In other words, the Silk Road in reality runs through the ports of Gujarat. There was not a single Chinese mission to Rome, a diplomatic mission, nor one from Rome to China. No traveler is ever known to have passed along that route. But there is a regular, annual, colossal traffic up and down this very short route of just 2.5 months. And this is what we have to thank for it. In Tibet, now we have a freeze taking place, and the cold winds are raking into the Tibetan plateau. In spring, there is a thaw, and the warm winds blow out. And this pattern has meant that Indian sailors throughout history have only had to put up a sail, and in 2 months they find themselves in Ethiopia, or Aden, or in the Red Sea. Or, if they're heading from the east coast, through the Malacca Straits, to the Mekong Delta, and on to China. is meteorology and geography that has predetermined that there will always be trading communities in India. Looking historically from Tamil Nadu over to Burma, or from the west coast, from Gujarat to East Africa. This is determined by the winds, but no other country in the world is blessed by winds that blow with great reliability, fast in one direction for 6 months, and then equally fast in reverse for the other 6 months. So if you're a Roman sailor from Maziris, a Malu sailor from Maziris, you just set off. You're in Mussel Harbour or Berenike in 2 months. You sell your goods, you go to a show in Alexandria, you go and visit the pyramids, you wait for the winds to turn, and back you go 2 months more. No other country in the world has that incredible gift from nature that has given this country its centrality in the trade routes. And it isn't just India, of course, that is using this. We have these extraordinary Ethiopian figures in the Amaravati marbles. This is in the one of the very worst museum displays in India, I should say, in strong contrast to the wonderful CSMVS, the Madras Central Museum, where it is hidden behind perspex. It's almost impossible to crawl on your hands and knees between these places to see these things. But here we are. Look, these wonderful Ethiopian pages waiting on an Indian ruler, while some sort of Indian prince, Ethiopian prince, is introduced to the ruler at the court. And this is another new discovery which has changed the entire story. This is the Maziris papyrus. In Egypt, for 150 years, papyruses have turned up, particularly in the rubbish dumps of Oxyrhynchus, halfway down the Nile. On the first day that the British archaeologists Hunt and Grenfell went to Oxyrhynchus, they kicked the ground, pulled out of it some lesbian love poetry by Sappho, lost verses of Sappho, and a fragment of the lost Gospel of St. Thomas. This probably comes from the same rubbish dump, though it was on the black market and is now in Vienna. It tells in detail, it is a shipping invoice, like is presumably made out in Bombay every day. And it gives exact details about one container on one ship traveling about 120 AD. The ship is called the Hemapolon, and it's sailing from Maziris, as the papyrus name suggests, to Alexandria. Inside is a whole series of very expensive luxury products. What were these products? Well, we luckily have some illustrations of this in Sicily, of all places, in the villa of a merchant who presumably was working on this route. And he's showing his visitors how he made his money. There was a great premium, incidentally, in having Indian goods in Rome. We know about one of Nero's mistresses, Lolina Paulinus, who not only covered her feet, her legs, her body, and her breasts with Indian gems, she apparently carried the invoice, the receipt, to parties to show people how much it all cost. And it is from that sort of background that we get this extraordinary mosaic. In the center, we have a yakshi touching a tree, exactly a motif that will flow through centuries of Indian art, right up to the time of the Rajputs and the Mughals, but which has its origins in the imagery of Mathura and the like, where you've got a fertility figure touching a tree and it blooms at her touch. Here's the Roman version of that, and she's touching a tree and the tree is flowering. But what is she advertising, so to speak? What is this merchant trying to show? Well, first of all, silk. Now, Pliny is very, very upset about silk. Pliny is a figure that's a very familiar stereotype even today, and I'm sure modern Plinys are propping up the bars all over Mumbai at this very moment. He is one of those sort of, he's a puritanical naval commander who is incensed at the libertine lifestyle of society women. And he says they spend all their money on silk, this immoral textile that shows a woman's limbs beneath the folds. He's equally incensed with this. What is this black powder that people put on their food, the young put on their food this day, this pepper? Why do people want this pungency and pay so much for it? But here we have an illustration of both, along with ivory, circus animals. We're going to see Gladiator 2 with the rhino, which could have come from Kaziranga for all we know, and possibly malabathrum, materials for perfumery. And what is important about the Mosiris papyrus is it tells us how much this cost. The particular container in the Hermapolon, traveling in 120 BC from Mosiris, from Kerala to Alexandria, contained, I can't remember the exact figure, is it 220 tons of ivory? 10 amphora full of black pepper, cotton, silk, nard, malabathrum. So valuable that if it successfully made it to Egypt, the importer with the profit could have bought the largest estate in Egypt or in central Tuscany, and with the spare change have entered the Senate. So you could become the Elon Musk of, God help you, of Roman Egypt with just one successful shipment of this enormous scale from Mosiris. But even more exciting is a third column in this papyrus, which tells about the customs take. And the customs take was 1/3. So with containers of this scale coming in at this value, 1/3 was an enormous boost to the Roman economy. And in the latest Cambridge Handbook to the Roman Economy, Andrew Wilson, who came up with that wonderful map I showed you earlier, is speculating that maybe a quarter of the entire Roman budget came from the customs take on the Red Sea coast. Hadrian's Wall, the Appian Way, the Roman road system, the fortresses in Algeria and the Rhine frontier, a quarter of all that was paid for by imports from India. It's an enormous new discovery. And it's a very exciting moment in these studies. So, you see items from this trade turning up in excavations, such as the famous Yaxi in Pompeii. But you also find items from items from Roman Egypt turning up in India or in South Asia. Here we've got Russell Crowe again, a gladiator, the Pharos Lighthouse, and the vine, the vintage. These are Alexandrian Greek beakers, shipped across the sea, punted up the Indus, and found, of all places, under the American Air Force Base in Bagram, in the Shamali Plain in Afghanistan. Porphyry vessels. And again, what's important is that these are specifically Roman Egyptian. That was the connection. It's not stuff coming from Gaul or Spain. It's stuff coming from Roman Egypt. And the Coptic connection is there in the art too. We've got a Coptic papyrus with Jesus and his disciples, and in Miran, over the border into Xinjiang, but artistically part of Gandhara, we've got the Buddha and his disciples with exactly the same iconography. And it is from this, partially, maybe, that we get this movement in Buddhism from the aniconic Buddha, the pillar of flame, the stupa, the wheel of the law, the footprints, the empty throne of early Buddhism, to the image of the Buddha, which first probably appears in the Bimaran reliquary in the 1st century AD. And this is very important because it is this Roman-Egyptian trade peaking in the 1st and 2nd century that also seems to be behind Gandharan art. The Victorians always liked to imagine that Gandharan art was all about the lost legions of Alexander, stuck in the Hindu Kush, converting to Buddhism. But the timing doesn't work. The chronology is wrong. The Bactrian Greeks disappear from history about 150 BCE, and Gandharan, the image of the Buddha as a sort of vaguely Apollo-like figure, begins about 100 AD. And after that, you get these very, very classic, from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, you get these very, very classical-looking faces. It could be a Roman senator. Compare Augustus, look at the drapery of Augustus, compare it to a bodhisattva from Gandhara. This pointer is giving up. If there's any more batteries for the pointer, Jyoti, can we have it's nearly gone. Anyway, look at the similarity in the drapery. So heading on through the gorgeous Buddhas of Hadda into Afghanistan, and we begin to see these along the merchants' routes in the Buddhist monasteries on the road, outposts of Indian culture. Along with Buddhism come a whole series of Indian merchants, some of them Hindu. We find in Mezainak, this new site outside Kabul, in Logar province, as well as gorgeous gilt Buddhas from the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries, chapels of Durga and other Hindu gods and goddesses. And these are major centers that bring with them Indian learning, Indian ideas, moving along the trade routes into Afghanistan, particularly Bamiyan. There's the niche which the Bamiyan Buddha was in, but look at all these caves. Millions of little Ajantas and Elloras carved into this rock face in the center of Bamiyan. And while we're about this, if we now have Buddhas turning up on the Red Sea coast, and if, as we know, Judaism and Christianity are arriving at the same time in Kerala, is it too much to imagine that there must be some influence of the Buddhist monasticism on early Christian monasticism? Where does Christian monasticism begin? On the Red Sea. St. Anthony of Egypt founds the first Christian monastery in 300 AD, about 50 miles from where the Berenike Buddha was found. And the most crucial evidence for this is that those Coptic monasteries are vegetarian. This is not part of Christian culture normally. It isn't something I speculate on in the book, but the more I think about it, the more, if you've got Buddhist monks living in cave monasteries all the way up the Western Ghats, right up to Bamiyan, into Persia, and suddenly they start turning up around, suddenly Christian equivalents start turning up around 200, 300 AD at the peak of the Indian trade, when we know there were Buddhist monks in Alexandria. There must be a link between the two. It's not a natural, inherent thing. Sorry, can we have a new battery? It's not a natural thing to go and live in a cave in a desert. Brilliant, thank you. Perfect. So on into China. So Buddhism arrives in China as a foreign faith from India about 100 AD, the first references we have to it. It's associated with foreigners. By that stage, not just Indians, but Sogdians, Parthians, crossing along the trade routes towards the Chinese capital. And by the 5th or 6th century, you've got influence of Gupta art. This is one of the gorgeous bodhisattvas in Mathura, with this lovely little belly button and the pajama folds. And this gets copied in the art of Gansu and Western China. Before long, we have very Indian apsaras and Gandhavras and heavenly beings flying across the domes of Buddhist temples right into Western China. Some of the monks clearly on something pretty strong, judging by this, with the kind of Buddha floating around with flames shooting out of his feet and blue elephants. Whatever they were smoking, we should find out. But either way, by the 5th century, Buddhism is a major force in the Chinese court. Under Confucianism, under Taoism, but it is growing. And the guy that turns it around is none other than our old friend Xuanzang, the traveling monk. It used to be written Huansang in old textbooks. Xuanzang, with his natty backpack full of scrolls, and I like his little torch. This is totally given up, I'm afraid. With his natty little torch hanging from the top of his backpack, is the figure who makes a major change at this point. Crossing a nerdy scholar who was determined to mend the corruption of the text he felt he was using. Oh, this is more like it. Here we go. He illegally crosses out of China, along the trade routes, over the Taklamakan, over the Pamirs and the Himalayas to Kashmir, and then ultimately to Nalanda. And he is dazzled by Nalanda. 6 kings built as many monasteries around the site, one after another. An enclosure was made with bricks to merge them into one monastery. There were separate courtyards. Now, the courtyards are very important because this is exactly the model of an Oxbridge College or indeed something in Harvard. In Oxbridge, it would be grass, but here you have the cloister walk and the scholars' rooms over 2 stories. You can make a very coherent argument that this plan passes first in Logar province into the very first madrasas in the Islamic world, and hence via Al-Azhar and the North African coast into Islamic Spain. And it is in the territory bordering Islamic Spain that the first universities in the West are founded, at Bologna, in Salerno, in Paris, and then in Oxford and Cambridge. And that same plan is preserved. This is very like Oxford High Street, this bit of Nalanda, that you have a courtyard after courtyard after courtyard linked by a common road. Anyway, leaving that aside, no fresher at Oxbridge has ever been more thrilled to arrive at a college than Xuanzang was to arrive in Nalanda. And what absolutely burns for Xuanzang is the library, 9 stories high, containing 3 divisions: the Ratnadadi, the Sea of Jewels, the Ratnasagra, the Ocean of Jewels, and the Ratna Ranjaka, the jewel adorned. The priests, to the number of several thousand, from morning until night, the monks engage in discussions, the old and the young mutually help each other. Lectures are given in 100 different halls every day, and the students diligently study without wasting a moment. The atmosphere of the monastery was solemn and dignified. So he's dazzled by this, and he spends nearly 20 years in Nalanda copying out manuscripts from the library, which he then takes back to China, where he is received by Taizong, the Tang emperor, who builds him the Wild Goose Pagoda. Just to return to Nalanda, in the National Museum in Delhi, there is this extraordinary survival, which is the copper plate left by the king of Sri Vijaya, giving a benefaction of 100 villages to support scholars from Southeast Asia arriving at Nalanda. We know also of monks from Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, and even Korea who came to study there. So here is a verified trade route that results in a pilgrim route, which results in scholarly monks coming backwards and forwards from India to China. And here we have this benefaction, this extraordinary survival of a king of Sri Vijaya, modern Indonesia, founding a special college for Southeast Asians. But the most improbable ally who changes the face of Buddhism in China is not Taizong, but Taizong's 15-year-old concubine from the 5th rank called Wu Zetian. And Wu looks a bit of an old boot here, but she was clearly something. And perhaps we should forget that she looks like this and just go over to the Chinese soap opera, which makes much more sense of the story. So Wu is 15-year-old when Taizong is in his 60s. As he's dying, Xuanzang is preaching to him, and there's great hope that he will convert to Buddhism, but he dies before he does. At his death, the young Wu Zetian, along with the other queens and concubines, are thrown into a nunnery. They replace their gorgeous silks with Hessian. But a year later, in an unprecedented move, Gaizong, the son of Taizong, brings her back because they have already become lovers. He moves into his father's apartments when he's dying, and despite the taboo, she is brought back with the consent of the queen, the empress, who unwittingly, according to later biographers, had loosed a tiger on the mountain. And here is the tiger, and isn't she wonderful? Anyway, Wu Zetian comes back. She gets pregnant by Gaizong pretty quickly. A baby is born, it's a boy, and then 6 months later, the baby is found strangled. There is an investigation, and evidence is found pointing to the empress and the chief concubine, who are deemed to have been jealous of Wu and murdered the baby by witchcraft and by strangulation. They have their bones broken and they are drowned in a vat of wine. Wu becomes the next empress. Then Gaizong has a mysterious series of strokes and Wu takes over. And then Gaizong dies, and in an unprecedented move, Wu is not shoved into a nunnery, but becomes the only female emperor in 3,000 years of Chinese dynastic history. How does she do this? She does this with the aid of a sort of think tank. I don't know whether you have any equivalents in India to the sinister Tory think tanks in Tufton Street that brought about Brexit, but this is a similar sort of operation. These scholars of the Northern Gate, as they are called, are some of Xuanzang's protégés, many of them trained in Nalanda, and they come and announce that Wu is not just the emperor, she is the reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Maitreya. And that there are prophecies in the Diamond and the Lotus Sutras which say that this woman is a goddess who is prophesied for hundreds of years to come and save China. And using this and a whole load of bogus prophecies and bogus omens, she rules for 40 years and makes Buddhism the state religion of China. It doesn't last long, but for that 140-year period, the Confucians and the Taoists are removed from the center of things in the court, and Wu and her Buddhists, many of them Nalanda trained, take over. It is the high watermark of Indian influence in China. Meanwhile, this is also the peak period of Indian influence in Southeast Asia. When Rome falls in the 5th century, India has a major economic crisis. For 400 years, India has been receiving huge quantities of Roman gold in exactly the manner that Pliny describes. And suddenly, it's not there. It's as if, again, to bring up Elon Musk, it's as if everyone went over to battery-powered cars and Saudi Arabia suddenly found it had no money coming into its coffers after years of being used to having a flood of gold from all parts of the world. So what do they do to make up? The Tamil trading guilds pivot eastwards. And this is the period that we find the trading guilds looking to Bujang, Palembang, Keling, Kutai, Champa, Okeo, and Guangzhou. And these Tamil trading guilds are quite badass. They have a sort of guild of assassins who assassinate those who. There's a Chola inscriptions talking about the assassins employed by the Tamil trading guilds. They also have military forces, rather like a sort of proto-East India company. The Tamil trading guilds are not to be messed with, and these guys forge new trading systems, but typically they're after gold. And this is why this region comes to be known as Suvarna Bhumi, the lands of gold, and why Sarawak becomes Suvarna Dvipa, the island of gold. Because it is in this region that we find from the 5th century Tamil inscriptions at Takuapa, north of Bujang, a Tamil touchstone belonging to a gold merchant, a gold worker rather, who calls himself the greatest gold worker in Tamil on his little touchstone. So it wasn't just that they were excavating and buying the gold, they were processing it and converting it into jewelry on site to sell locally, as well as bring back to India. So a whole new center of gold is found in Southeast Asia, and these gold mines become the spur. Appearing in the Ramayana, you've got Sugriva telling Hanuman, you've got to go to Suvarna Dvipa, kick the ground and gold will appear. It's in the Jataka stories. Suvarna Bhumi, Suvarna Dvipa becomes the new trading center. And in the 5th and 6th centuries, you begin to see large numbers of Indian merchants swinging into Southeast Asia in ships like this, bound together by coconut fiber. And suddenly, in southern Thailand, you get these Dvaravati wheels modeled on prototypes in Sarnath. You get in the Bujang Valley in Malaysia, where I was this week, you get these very lovely early Buddhas from the 5th and 6th centuries. You get early lingams from Okeo and the Mekong Delta. This is from Bujang, Yoni, and an early image of Lord Shiva. So suddenly, these images and symbols are being found, but particularly the Mekong Delta becomes a major center. And you get with the delta like spokes in a wheel, these Khmer canals connecting Okeo with Angkor Wat, now separated Vietnam. Okeo is in Vietnam, Angkor Wat is in Cambodia. And you follow these ancient canals on your little putt-putt boat, and you find yourself on the edge of the lagoon in these little hillocks. And on these hillocks, you find some of the very earliest Hindu temples in Southeast Asia. Inside the temples, this is Ashram Maharose. Inside the temples, you find these extraordinary early images. Now, what's interesting about them is that from the beginning, while they obey the laws of the Shilpa Shastras, no one would ever confuse this with a sculpture from India. Physiognomically, it looks like a Khmer. He's wearing a sampot. And weirder things happen as it begins to spin off on its own axis, so to speak. Jayavarman II, the Khmer ruler with his little moustache, has himself depicted as Lord Vishnu with his discus and conch. Now, I may be wrong, but I don't know any examples of a ruler appearing as the deity. You have Raja Raja Chola being crowned by Lord Shiva, but you don't have Raja Raja Chola, as far as I know, ever appearing as Lord Shiva. Tell me if I'm wrong. This has a smack of blasphemy about it from an Indian perspective. And here's the sort of thing that we're seeing. We're seeing a local ruler on a throne surrounded by Indian Brahmins, and they're pouring a pot over him, the Abhisheka ceremony. And these guys begin to turn up in the 5th and 6th centuries. Chinese diplomats are writing home about them, slightly miffed that all these guys are now converting to a form of Hindu kingship. They're no longer called Kudunga like their grandfather on one inscription. They're called Suryavarman or Mullavarman. They take Sanskrit names. Before long, we have descriptions of the Ramayana being read out in Khmer temples. And we have this whole world of Sanskritization that takes place in the 5th and 6th centuries. And at the heart of that is the import of this writing system. Southern Brahmi, or Pallava Grantha as it used to be known, begins in Kanchipuram. It's a form of Brahmi designed for writing on palm leaf. You can't have the straight lines with the washing line of letters coming down from the washing line like you have in the north, because if you do straight lines on palm, you cut it. So you have curvilinear letters. And this is developed in Kanchipuram, and this becomes the basis for every script in Southeast Asia. Pew, Khmer, Mon, Thai, and so on. Every pre-Islamic script in Southeast Asia is based on this. And the Brahmins are getting a very good deal, but they're giving as much as they're taking. The Brahmins are offered estates, they're offered wives, they're lured to these courts. In return, they're bringing literacy, numeracy, and administrative practices. Presumably they help with the tax raising, with the taxation. But they also give the local ruler a link to the divine. Suddenly he is not just the local strongman, he is the friend of Lord Shiva, he's the friend of Lord Vishnu. And what are these guys doing here? Because they're not meant, surely, to cross the Black Water. India is defined very early on, as the sadhus tell Alexander the Great. To the west, there is the Indus. To the east, there is the Ganges. And to the south, the sea. So if you move beyond the Ganges, you leave India, and that is not something that the Puranas or the laws of Manu will countenance. So what do? You move the Ganga. Suddenly you sculpt in the headwaters of these rivers lingams and yonis, sacralizing the river. And some scholars, this is not everyone's etymology, but there may well be a link between Ma Ganga and Mekong. Mekong could be a form of Ma Ganga. Certainly we have Kurukshetra, north of Delhi, reborn in Laos. We have Ayodhya, reborn outside Thailand. And suddenly this whole landscape, every Shaivite shrine in India finds its counterpart in these great multi-story pyramid Khmer temples, which may or may not have their basis in these Gupta pyramid temples in UP. But anyway, the landscape begins to be rechristened. And you get echoes of the Indian temples. So this is the Shore Temple at Mamallapuram. And here we have something pretty similar in Gadong Songo 5 years later. Pretty similar, but not identical, because you've got little Chinese finials. You've got these tall, narrow gateways. This is not a copy of a Pallava temple. It's a kind of variation on it. And then by the 9th and 10th century, by the time you get to Prambanan, you're getting larger temples being built in Southeast Asia than you are in India. India remains fractured between many kingdoms, but by the 9th century, you're getting two enormous mega kingdoms growing in Southeast Asia, Sri Vijaya and the Khmer Empire. And it is in Prambanan that we get a 150-part sculpture of the Ramayana. This is Lord Ram shooting the golden deer with Lakshman looking on anxiously behind him. You don't get this, I think, in India until Hampi. And then Borobudur. Swati Chamburkar is in the audience somewhere. She's written on the links between Kesaria and Sompur Mahavihara in India, and this extraordinary form of... Well, Borobudur is an incredible monument. It's shaped like a yantra. It's got 5 successive stories. At the beginning, you start with the story of the Buddha. You then end up with ever more esoteric Mahayana texts until you arrive at the top with these extraordinary latticed stupas. These gorgeous Prambanan bodhisattvas. And finally, by the 12th century, Angkor Wat, the largest Hindu temple in the world. Allegedly, the outer moat alone contains, within it is an area 4 times the size of the Vatican City. It's the largest religious monument anywhere in the world from the Middle Ages. An extraordinary moment. But again, it is Indic, and yet it's not like anything in India. When Tagore goes here in 1920, he brilliantly writes, solving a problem that scholars fight about for 50 years. Everywhere I saw India, yet I could not recognize her. And there's been this push and pull. Do we talk about Indianization? Is that a dirty word? Tagore gets it right. This is something different, because what you're getting in Southeast Asia is profoundly different from India. This is Hinduism with pork, without caste, and with female Brahmins. In all sorts of ways, it's very different. When you go to Bali today, the Hindu faith lived there is very different from the faith lived here. In the center of Angkor Wat, in the center of this quincunx of towers, I love to be able to use that word, the 5 on a dice is a quincunx. The central tower contains the ashes of Suryavarman II. I don't know, again, any example in India of a ruler with his ashes in the center of a temple. It's a profoundly different conception, and yet every individual element has its precedent in India. So finally, just to finish off, numbers. So, we were in 1120, Suryavarman II's Khmer Empire in Angkor Wat. We're now going back 600 years to the Gupta period in India. And as all your school textbooks will have told you, the golden age of the Guptas, in inverted commas, the period of Kalidasa, Shakuntala, the Cloud Messenger, the Kama Sutra, but also Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. Aryabhatta is sitting in Pataliputra, comes up with the exact circumference of the Earth, the distance to the sun, and 1,000 years before Galileo, the fact that the Earth spins on its own axis. A generation later, he passes the baton to Brahmagupta, who's sitting on Mount Abu in Rajasthan, who meditates on zero and sunya, the void, and comes up with definitions of zero as a number. Not an absence, not a placeholder, but a number with its own properties, such as it is the number you get when you subtract a number from itself. And by giving zero its power, by making it a number with its own properties, you suddenly can bring in place value, the decimal system, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, the binary system, a whole new world of mathematics opens up. And you see this displayed at Udaygiri in Madhya Pradesh, near Sanchi, near Bhopal. Here, Varaha rises out of the floodwaters with his foot on the coils of a Naga Sadhu. And there, behind him, is the headless but gym-buffed body of Chandragupta II, fresh from working out, apparently. And this whole Udaygiri site is an extraordinary testament to Gupta astronomy. There are sight lines, there are observation platforms. It's exactly on the Tropic of Cancer. There are water clocks. This whole image of Varaha rising out of the water did literally do that. This was a channel of water that was open to hydraulic manipulation, and water would have poured down through this whole system so that Varaha did actually rise out of the depths originally. And here we have Chandragupta II on his horse. So, out of all this comes the first zero, K127 in Siem Reap, and then the first one in India, in Gwalior. And here we have our numbers, 270, including the polo mint shape of R0 today. And this is a slightly disappointing inscription. You imagine that the first datable zero in India would have some profound mathematical riddle in it. It actually is just the number of marigolds that someone has to give to the temple. But it's the starting off point for amazing things. And this is something that should be in every textbook, in every classroom, anywhere in the world, where our numbers come from, beginning with Brahmi, heading through Gwalior, and then it trifurcates into 3 different directions. The whole Indic, Sanskrit, and Devanagari column, the Eastern Arabic column, the numbers used today in Saudi Arabia and Iraq and so on, and finally the West Arabic numbers, developed in Morocco and Spain, which become our numbers by the 16th century. And how do they get to the Middle East? Well, improbably there's a Disney character that carries the baton. Those of you who have put children in front of Aladdin may not have realized that you are touching on the figure who made this important step. But Jafar in Aladdin is one of the Barmakid family, 4 generations of viziers in Baghdad who previously were Sanskrit literate, Buddhist, hereditary abbots of the monastery of Naubahar outside Balkh in Afghanistan. As soon as they come to power and build Baghdad, Khalid ibn Barmak, the first of their number, is one of the planners of Baghdad, and the first thing he does as vizier is to bring a delegation of Indians from Sindh with the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta to Baghdad, along with books of Charaka and Ayurvedic medicine. And the Barmakids rule for 4 generations, but it's only a generation after that, after the Barmakids have been swept out of power, that a young man arrives from what we would call Khiva in northern Uzbekistan, but in those days was called Khwarazm. And as the young man from Khwarazm, he is known as Al-Khwarizmi. Here's a map to, no, we haven't got a map yet. We have the title of the book. He arrives in the Beit al-Hikmah, the library of Baghdad, and he produces out of these very complex Sanskrit manuscripts of mathematics a simple, clear account in Arabic prose of the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, which he calls the compendious book of calculating by completion and balancing according to Hindu calculation. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, even in Arabic, perhaps especially in Arabic, so it's just known by its nickname algebra, our word, while Al-Khwarizmi is the source of our word algorithm. So all this is the passage of Indic numbers from Pataliputra to Mount Abu via Sindh. And along with it, of course, comes, at the same sort of time, comes chess. Out of India, into Persia, from Persia, into the Arab world. The Barmakids, again, are great champions of chess. When you say checkmate in chess, that is, you're speaking Persian. It's Shamat. The king is dead. Anyway, so this is the passage. So here is Sindh. Any Sindhis in the audience feel very proud of yourselves? Yes, hands up, every Sindhi. This is your moment. So the delegation from Sindh brings the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta to Baghdad. This best pointer's gone again. Anyway, never mind. And Baghdad, I can have to take the point here. And then Al-Khwarizmi comes from Khwarazm up at the top right to Baghdad, translates Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, and it passes through Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, and Spain. And in the early 10th century, we get the first Christian monks coming to Barcelona, or particularly the monastery of Ripoll outside Barcelona, to study the Indic numbers. And they are known as Indic numbers. They are referred to as the modus Indorum, the method of the Indians. And the 9 Indian numbers plus 0. Everyone at this point is well aware that these things come from India. And yet, it's another 2.5 centuries before this stuff takes off in Europe. And what happens is that Pisa, at the top left of the boot of Italy, comes down and founds a trading colony in Algeria. And the notary who runs this trading post brings his son. And his son goes to the local school. He learns Arabic numbers. And luckily for us, that kid is Fibonacci. So Fibonacci then goes back to Italy, where he finds his mates are busy still doing MCV XV1 times CCM XLV. And he writes the Liber Abaci, or the Book of Numbers, which introduces Europeans to this number system, the modus Indorum. Shortly afterwards, Frederick II, Stupor Mundi, comes to Pisa, and they have a sort of mathematical contest. The mathematicians of the court are raged against Fibonacci, and of course, Fibonacci, being Fibonacci, wipes the floor with them. And so he's called to the gorgeous Castel del Monte in Puglia, where, I'm glad to say, an important and again improbable meeting takes place with a Scotsman, Michael Scott, who is the court astrologer and mathematician and astronomer of Frederick II. And Michael Scott, who has studied in Toledo, speaks Arabic, already knows this number system, realizes the genius of Fibonacci's Liber Abaci, but says, look here, pal, it's all a wee bit theoretical. You've got to make it more practical. And so Fibonacci puts in interest rates, weights and measures, money conversion, and double accounting. And these practical steps means that the Liber Abaci becomes the Italian primer on mathematics and generates the banking revolution of the Medici. Fibonacci is the favorite reading of none other than Piero della Francesca, who's sitting in San Sepolcro in Tuscany, writes 3 mathematical treatises on the number systems of India and Fibonacci. And these are then plagiarized by his friend Fra Luca Caroli, who takes them to Milan and shares them with his flatmate, who is called Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci is painting a painting at that moment called The Last Supper. So all this joins up in the most satisfactory manner. But it is ultimately, I think you could say, through the facility in numbers that Fibonacci brings to Europe, that the European Corporation is born. And with the European Corporation, the East India Company, who bring those weapons back to India. But as they say, the East India Company is another lecture for another day. Thank you very much indeed.